The year is 476 AD. A heavy autumn rain falls on the city of Rome, a city that has been the center of a vast empire for centuries, but now feels more like a cold, damp museum of its former self. Inside a modest villa, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus plays with wooden soldiers, unaware that his name, a combination of the city's mythical founder and its first emperor, is a tragic irony. Outside the city walls, the rumble of a Germanic army is not a distant threat, but an immediate presence. The air is thick with the scent of whetstone and decay, a fitting perfume for an empire in its final, wheezing moments. Odoacer, a soldier of Germanic heritage who has risen to command the barbarian forces, sits in a tent, his gaze fixed on the flickering light of an oil lamp, not with ambition, but with the weary pragmatism of a man tasked with cleaning up a mess. His men, a motley collection of Heruli, Syrian, and other Gothic tribes, are not here to burn the city to the ground. They are here to collect their long overdue land grants, tired of fighting for a Rome that can no longer pay its bills. The city's inhabitants, huddled in their homes, listen to the rain and the silence that follows, a silence more terrifying than any battle cry, for it heralds an ending they can't yet comprehend. It's a moment of profound quiet, a historical pause between the final gasp of one world and the first fragile breath of another. Did you know this was the night that the last Western Roman emperor was deposed? An event so subtle that many at the time didn't even realize they were living through the end of an era. And with that, let's begin to explore the long, strange sleep of Europe, a sleep that we call the Middle Ages, as we drift off into the past. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to share where you're from and what time it is for you in the comments, and maybe we can find a little bit of shared history, even across the miles. The Roman Empire, the one centered in Rome, had been in a slow, agonizing decline for quite a while, almost like a slow-motion car crash that takes centuries to play out. The grand story of Rome, with all its Caesars and legions, was over. What happened instead was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual fragmentation. The vast, unified empire, with its roads, laws, and legions, began to fracture into smaller, more manageable pieces. The men who took over weren't interested in destroying what was there. They just wanted to run things their own way. They were often Romanized to some degree, having served in the Roman army or lived within the empire's borders, so they didn't want to toss everything out. Instead, they just changed the letterhead, so to speak. We see this most clearly in the rise of what are often called the barbarian kingdoms. Now that word barbarian is a little loaded, isn't it? It comes from the Greek word barbaros, which just meant anyone who wasn't Greek, and then the Romans used it for anyone who wasn't Roman. Basically, it meant outsider. But these outsiders, these Germanic tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks, were not just a bunch of uncivilized, wild-haired ruffians. They were often skilled warriors, organized in their own ways, and they had been interacting with the Roman Empire for a very long time. In many cases, they had been hired by the Romans as mercenaries, or given land to settle on as foederati, or allies. So when the empire finally couldn't hold itself together, They simply stepped into the power vacuum and established their own kingdoms on what had once been Roman soil. In Italy, Odoacer, after removing Romulus Augustulus, didn't declare himself emperor. He took the title King of Italy, and for a time he even sent tribute to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, a kind of nod to the old ways. This created a very interesting and sometimes messy hybrid society. Roman law and administration, what was left of it, often existed side by side with the customs and tribal laws of the new rulers. In Spain, the Visigoths established a kingdom that lasted for centuries, blending Roman traditions with their own. In North Africa, the Vandals created a maritime kingdom that controlled the seas and famously sacked Rome in 455 AD, not because they were especially cruel, but because they were short on cash, and Rome was a tempting target. In what is now France, the Burgundians and the Franks carved out their own territories. This wasn't a neat, clean transition. There were plenty of battles and betrayals as different groups jockeyed for power. It was a time of immense change, and for the average person living through it, it must have felt less like a grand historical turning point and more like a period of instability and constant worry. Your local lord might change, the tax collector might be speaking a different language, and the old Roman road might be falling into disrepair. The great Roman infrastructure, the aqueducts, the baths, the roads, all of it began to decay, not because of malicious destruction, but because there was no longer a central authority to maintain it. It's a bit like watching a magnificent house fall into disrepair when the family that lived in it is gone. The Roman legal system, with its complex codes and standardized laws, also began to fall apart, replaced by a patchwork of different legal traditions. The old Roman villas were abandoned, and people began to retreat into smaller, more defensible settlements. The economy, which had been based on a vast network of trade and a standardized currency, contracted dramatically. People went back to bartering, and local economies became the norm. The grand villas of the Roman elite were replaced by smaller, more fortified manors. The old Roman schools and libraries, for the most part, closed down or were neglected, and literacy rates began to drop. It's hard to overstate just how much was lost in this transition. However, a new force was beginning to rise in the vacuum left by Rome. The Christian Church, which had been on the fringes of the empire for centuries, now found itself in a position of authority. Bishops often became the de facto leaders of their cities, negotiating with the new Germanic kings and providing a sense of stability and continuity in a rapidly changing world. The Church, with its universal message and its organized structure, would become the one institution that managed to survive the fall of Rome and provide a crucial link to the past. While the Western Roman Empire was busy collapsing, a different story was unfolding to the east. There, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in the gleaming city of Constantinople, was not just surviving, it was thriving. Imagine a bustling metropolis with a population of hundreds of thousands, a city built on a strategic peninsula that controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia. The air here wasn't damp with decay. It hummed with commerce and the sounds of a vibrant, living culture. This was a place of vast libraries, monumental churches, and a powerful army and navy. The people there didn't think of themselves as Eastern Romans. They simply saw themselves as Romans. They were the true inheritors of the legacy of Augustus, and they called their empire Romania. To us, however, we often refer to it by a different name, the Byzantine Empire. This empire's longevity was due in no small part to its location and its strong, centralized leadership. While the West was being carved up by Germanic warlords, Constantinople was a fortress protected by formidable walls that proved almost impregnable for centuries. The emperors, while often facing their own internal dramas and power struggles, maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy and a legal system based on Roman law. They were able to collect taxes and pay their armies and maintain a level of stability that was simply a distant memory in the West. It was an empire of grandeur and immense wealth, a sort of historical anachronism that kept the flame of Roman civilization burning bright while much of the West was plunging into what some historians might call a dark age, though that term itself is a little too dramatic, a bit like calling a cloudy day an eternal night. The star of this particular show, and a key figure in this era, was Justinian the Feudalist, who reigned from 527 to 565 AD. Justinian had a grand ambition to restore the glory of the old Roman Empire, to reconquer the lost western provinces, and to create a unified Christian realm under his rule. He was a man who believed in the power of law and order, and he undertook the monumental task of compiling and codifying all of Roman law. This effort resulted in the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law. It was a massive legal text, a comprehensive summary of centuries of Roman jurisprudence, and it became the foundation for legal systems across much of Europe for the rest of history. It's so influential that even today, many legal traditions have their roots in Justinian's work. It's a bit like a modern programmer going back and finding the original source code for the entire legal system. Justinian's reign was also a period of remarkable building projects. He commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a magnificent church in Constantinople that for over 1,000 years was the largest cathedral in the world. It was a feat of engineering and artistry, with its massive dome seemingly floating in the air. The interior was a dazzling display of mosaics and marble, designed to evoke a sense of awe and divine presence. The very existence of this building was a testament to the wealth and power of the Byzantine Empire. Justinian also oversaw the construction of churches, bridges, and aqueducts, all part of his grand vision for a restored Roman world. Of course, a grand vision often comes with a hefty price tag, and Justinian's ambitious reconquests of Italy and North Africa were incredibly expensive and bloody. His brilliant general Belisarius led the campaigns, a man of such tactical genius that he sometimes won battles by just showing up. Historians still argue whether the resources spent on these wars were ultimately worth it. The Byzantines did succeed in reclaiming large parts of the former Western Empire, but they were never able to hold them securely. The lands were ravaged, the coffers were emptied, and the empire was left vulnerable to other threats on its borders, especially from the Sasanian Empire in Persia, and later, the rising power of the Arabs. It's a classic case of overstretching your resources. You try to do too much, and you end up doing none of it particularly well. Internally, The Byzantine Empire was also a complex society with its own unique flavor. Unlike the Latin-speaking West, the Byzantines spoke Greek, a language that had been the tongue of scholars and merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. This linguistic difference, coupled with some theological disagreements, like the role of icons in worship, eventually led to a deep and lasting split between the Eastern and Western churches. This split, known as the Great Schism, wouldn't become official for several more centuries, but the seeds of it were sown in this early period. The Byzantine court was also a place of elaborate ceremony and intricate etiquette, a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble halls of the barbarian kings in the West. The emperor was not just a king, but a divinely appointed ruler, the earthly representative of God, and his court rituals reflected this sacred status. While in the West, kings might lead their armies from the front, a Byzantine emperor was often seen as a semi-divine figure, an emperor by the grace of God. So while Europe was splintering and reorganizing itself, Constantinople remained a beacon of classical civilization, a powerful and sophisticated empire that preserved the Roman legacy in its own unique form. It was a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval world, a place where Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology all met and mingled. It was a truly remarkable civilization, a testament to the idea that even when one part of an empire fades, the other can continue to shine. They were, in a sense, the last Romans. With the fall of Rome in the West and the Byzantines holding strong in the East, the stage was set for new powers to rise. And one of the most successful of these new groups were the Franks, a collection of Germanic tribes who had settled in what is now modern-day France and parts of Germany. Unlike some of the other barbarian kingdoms, who were Arian Christians, a different flavor of the faith, the Franks eventually converted to Catholic Christianity. This single decision would have immense and lasting consequences. The most important figure in this early Frankish story was a man named Clovis III. He was a military leader of the Salian Franks, and he managed to unite all the different Frankish tribes under his rule. He was a ruthless and pragmatic leader, and his conversion to Catholic Christianity around 496 AD was a masterstroke, whether it was from genuine conviction or political savvy. This conversion wasn't just a personal choice. It was a strategic move that gave him the powerful backing of the Catholic Church and the Gallo-Roman population who already lived in his territories. Think of it this way. All the other Germanic kings were seen as heretics by the Church and their Roman subjects. Clovis, however, was seen as a liberator and a true Christian king. This gave him a massive advantage in his conquests. He was able to expand his kingdom and defeat his rivals, not just with swords and shields, but with the moral authority of the Church. He consolidated Frankish power, defeated the Visigoths in Gaul, and laid the foundation for a kingdom that would become one of the most powerful in Europe. This dynasty, started by Clovis, is known as the Merovingian dynasty, named for a mythical ancestor. For a couple of centuries, they ruled over a vast, if sometimes fractured, kingdom. Life in the Merovingian kingdom was a blend of old and new. Roman law and institutions slowly faded, replaced by Germanic customs and legal traditions, like trial by ordeal and the Wehrgild, a system where a person's life had a specific monetary value, and a person who killed them would have to pay that amount to their family. This was a kind of ancient insurance policy to prevent blood feuds from spiraling out of control. The Merovingian kings, though, were a little, well, let's just say they weren't the most focused bunch. As time went on, the kings became known as the rois fainéants, or the do-nothing kings. They were more interested in the pleasures of the court than the hard work of governing. They had long hair, which was a symbol of their royal power, and they would be paraded around in ox carts, giving a grand, if slightly lazy, impression of their authority. The real power behind the throne began to reside with the mayor of the palace, a sort of chief administrator who handled all the day-to-day business of the kingdom. One of these mayors was a man named Charles Martel. Now, Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, was anything but a do-nothing. He was a brilliant military leader who took effective control of the Frankish kingdom, though he never took the title of king himself. His name is forever linked to one pivotal moment in history, the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. At this time, a new and powerful force was emerging from the south, the Umayyad Caliphate, a vast Islamic empire that had swept across North Africa and conquered the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. They began to raid into Frankish territory, and it seemed as though all of Europe might fall to their advance. But Charles Martel, with his hardened Frankish soldiers, met them on the battlefield near the city of Tours. Historians still argue whether the fate of all of Western Europe hung on this battle. While the Umayyad advance might have been more of a raiding party than a full-scale invasion, the Frankish victory was still hugely significant. Charles Martel and his forces stopped the Muslim advance, a victory that was seen by contemporaries as a divine sign that the Franks were the true protectors of Christendom. This battle cemented the power of Charles and his family, a family that would soon take the crown for themselves. It was a moment that underscored the growing importance of the Franks as a military power in Europe, a power that could defend against a seemingly unstoppable foe. It's hard to overstate the importance of this event for the perception of the Franks as Europe's great military hope, and it was certainly a good day for Charles and his dynasty, known as the Carolingians. His son, Pepin the Short, would eventually, with the blessing of the Pope, depose the last of the lazy Merovingian kings and take the crown for himself, officially starting the new royal line. So, from a loose confederation of tribes, the Franks, under the leadership of Clovis and later Charles Martel, became the dominant power in post-Roman Europe. Their conversion to Catholicism gave them a unique legitimacy, and their military prowess made them a force to be reckoned with. They were a kingdom that was beginning to look less like a barbarian successor state and more like a true, powerful empire in its own right, a testament to what a little ambition and a good public relations strategy can do. With the Carolingian dynasty now firmly in place, the stage was set for its greatest and most legendary ruler, Charlemagne, whose name literally means Charles the Great. Born around 742 AD, he was the grandson of Charles Martel and the son of Pepin the Short. When he inherited the throne, the Frankish kingdom was already a powerful state, but under his leadership, it would expand dramatically and reach heights not seen in Western Europe since the days of Rome itself. Charlemagne was a man of immense energy and ambition, a warrior king who spent most of his long reign on horseback, leading his armies on one campaign after another. He conquered the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in what is now Germany, and even pushed back the Arabs in Spain, though his success there was more limited. He was not just a conqueror, he was a fierce defender of the faith, and he often gave his defeated enemies a simple choice: baptism or death. His Saxon campaigns, in particular, were brutal, and he forced the conversion of an entire people, sometimes at the point of a sword. It's hard to imagine a more thorough and more terrifying evangelist. Charlemagne's kingdom grew to encompass much of modern-day France, Germany, and Italy, a sprawling empire that required a new kind of administration to hold it all together. He divided his vast territory into counties, each governed by a count, and he appointed special royal envoys known as missi dominici to travel throughout the empire and ensure that his will was being carried out. These envoys, a pair consisting of a layman and a cleric, were meant to be a check on the power of the counts, a sort of medieval inspector general system. Charlemagne was also a great patron of learning, even though he himself, famously, could barely read and write. He surrounded himself with the best scholars of his day, most notably an Anglo-Saxon monk named Alcuin of York, and he established a palace school at his capital, Aachen. This period, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, was a remarkable, if brief, revival of scholarship and culture. Scribes diligently copied ancient texts, preserving them for future generations, and scholars developed a new, more legible script known as Carolingian minuscule, which is the basis for the lowercase letters we use today. It's a quiet but profound legacy, the fact that you're reading this right now in a font descended from his scribes. The true pinnacle of his reign, however, came on Christmas Day in the year 800 AD. In a ceremony in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This was a truly revolutionary moment. For the first time since 476, there was a Roman emperor in the West again. This was a symbol that a new imperial power had emerged, one that was not based in Constantinople, but in the heart of Europe itself, and one that was closely tied to the Christian Church. This act created a complex new political reality. The Byzantines in Constantinople were, to put it mildly, not thrilled about this. They saw themselves as the one and only true inheritors of the Roman Empire, and considered Charlemagne to be a usurper. For the next several hundred years, Europe would have two emperors, one in the east and one in the west, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of the Roman legacy. Historians still debate what exactly this coronation meant. Was it an attempt by the Pope to assert his authority over secular rulers? Or was it Charlemagne's way of legitimizing his vast new empire? Regardless of the motive, Charlemagne's coronation and subsequent reign laid the groundwork for the political landscape of medieval Europe. The idea of a unified Christian empire, or Christendom, with a single emperor and a single pope, became a powerful and enduring concept, even if the reality was always much messier. The empire, however, didn't last long after his death in 814 AD. He had three grandsons, and according to Frankish tradition, they divided the empire among themselves in the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. This division created the rough outlines of what would become modern-day France, Germany, and the borderlands in between, a sort of geographical divorce that shaped the political map of Europe for centuries. While the Carolingian Empire fractured, the idea of the emperor, tied to both Rome and the Church, lived on. It was a brief flicker of a revived Roman Empire, a last great attempt at unified rule in the West for a very long time. With Charlemagne's death, the great centralizing force was gone, and Europe began to splinter once more, but with the memory of a golden age still fresh in its mind. As the great Carolingian Empire began to fracture, new threats emerged from all directions. One of the most famous and most feared were the Vikings. Imagine the scene: a quiet coastal monastery in England just before dawn. The monks are at their prayers, the air is cold and still, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Then a low, guttural murmur rises from the sea, a rhythmic sound of oar strokes and strange, foreign chants. The first sight is a line of magnificent longships, with their carved dragon heads and striped sails, appearing like ghosts in the morning mist. This wasn't a friendly visit. These were the Vikings, and their arrival meant plunder, destruction, and a whole lot of trouble for the sleepy kingdoms of Europe. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century and lasted for about 250 years. These were not a single unified group, but a diverse collection of Norse peoples from Scandinavia, including Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes. They were skilled seafarers and warriors, driven by a combination of factors: overpopulation in their homelands, a desire for wealth and glory, and a kind of adventurous spirit that pushed them to explore the known world and beyond. Their raids began with isolated attacks on vulnerable coastal targets, like the monastery at Lindisfarne in England in 793 AD. This particular raid, which was famously documented, sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. The monks were slaughtered, the treasures were stolen, and the idea of a safe and peaceful life became a thing of the past for many who lived near the coast. Over time, these raids evolved from hit-and-run attacks into full-scale invasions and settlements. The Vikings, seeing the rich farmland and opportunities in places like England, France, and Russia, decided that raiding was great, but living there was even better. The Danish Vikings carved out a large area in eastern England, known as the Danelaw, a region where their laws and customs prevailed. In what is now France, a group of Vikings led by a chieftain named Rollo were granted a territory by the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, in 911 AD. This territory, originally known as the Duchy of Normandy, which literally means land of the Northmen, would become one of the most powerful states in Europe. It was a classic example of an old problem becoming a new, and sometimes surprisingly successful, solution. The Frankish king basically said, if you can't beat 'em, give 'em a bunch of land and have them protect us from their friends. It worked. Meanwhile, the Norwegian Vikings ventured west, colonizing Iceland and Greenland, and even establishing a short-lived settlement in North America, which they called Vinland, around the year 1000 AD. We know about this thanks to archaeological evidence and the Icelandic sagas, a collection of epic poems and stories that chronicle their adventures. Think of them as the original globetrotters with a bit of a raiding habit. The Swedish Vikings, or Varangians, headed east, traveling down the great rivers of Russia, where they established trading posts and formed the basis of the early Russian state, centered around the city of Kiev. They were not just raiders, they were also traders, establishing vast commercial networks that stretched all the way from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire, selling furs, slaves, and amber in exchange for silver and other luxury goods. Their influence was so significant that the very word for Russia, Rus, is thought to be a Viking word. The impact of the Vikings was immense and multifaceted. On the one hand, they caused widespread disruption and destruction. Castles were built, not just to fight other knights, but to defend against those northern invaders. Kings had to become more organized, raising armies and navies to defend their realms. On the other hand, the Vikings were also agents of change and development. They opened up new trade routes, brought new ideas and technologies, and their settlements often became dynamic centers of commerce. Their presence forced local powers to consolidate, which ironically contributed to the formation of stronger kingdoms like the ones in England. The end of the Viking Age wasn't a single event, but a gradual process. As the Scandinavian kingdoms became more centralized and converted to Christianity, the raiding impulse faded. The Viking warriors became less interested in plundering foreign lands and more interested in the new power and prestige of being a king. It's almost as if they all collectively decided that a nice, cozy kingdom was better than another cold, wet sea journey. As the great Carolingian Empire dissolved and the Vikings roamed the seas, a new social and economic order began to take root in the fragmented lands of Western Europe. This system, known as feudalism, was a direct response to the lack of a strong, central government and the constant threat of invasion. It wasn't a neat, organized system with a single architect. Rather, it was a messy, localized, and practical solution to the problems of a dangerous world. It was a hierarchy of power and obligation built on the one thing that still mattered: land. At the very top of this pyramid was the king, who theoretically owned all the land. But in reality, a king's power was often limited and depended entirely on the loyalty of his most powerful subjects. To secure this loyalty, the king would grant large estates of land, known as fiefs, to his most important nobles. In return for this grant of land, the noble, now a vassal, would swear an oath of fealty or loyalty to the king. This oath wasn't just a promise. It was a sacred vow to provide military service, offer counsel, and give financial support when needed. It was a reciprocal relationship. The king gave land and protection, and the vassal gave service and loyalty. This was the core of the feudal contract. These powerful nobles, or great vassals, would then subdivide their own lands and grant them to lesser nobles, creating a cascading chain of loyalty. A duke might grant a fief to a count, who in turn might grant a smaller piece of land to a baron, who might finally grant a small plot to a knight. Each person in this chain was both a lord to those below him and a vassal to those above him. It was a complex web of personal relationships and obligations that held society together. A knight's loyalty was to his immediate lord, not to the king, and this often led to conflicts and civil wars, because when a lord and his king had a disagreement, the knight was stuck in the middle. It's a bit like a modern day franchise where your loyalty is to the local owner, not the corporate headquarters. Underneath all of this, holding up the entire social structure, were the vast majority of the population, the peasants. These peasants were tied to the land and lived and worked on large estates known as manors. This economic system, which existed alongside the political system of feudalism, is called Manorialism. The manor was a self-sufficient little world containing a lord's house, a village, a church, and the fields that were worked by the villagers. The land on the manor was divided into two main parts: the lord's domain, which the peasants had to work for free, and the peasant holdings, which they could work for themselves. Most peasants weren't free men, they were serfs. A serf was not a slave, as they could not be bought or sold, but they were not free either. They were bound to the land and could not leave without the Lord's permission. In exchange for the Lord's protection and the right to work their land, they had to pay rent in the form of labor, a portion of their harvest, or sometimes a little bit of money. They also had to pay fees to use the Lord's mill to grind their grain or the Lord's oven to bake their bread. Life for a serf was a cycle of backbreaking labor, from dawn to dusk, plowing fields, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops. Their lives were harsh and often short, and they had very little control over their own destiny. The knight, on the other hand, was the professional warrior of the society. They were the military arm of the feudal system, the men in shining armor who defended the land and the people. To become a knight was a long process of training, starting as a page in a noble household, and then a squire to a knight. The knight's life was centered around combat and chivalry, a code of conduct that in theory called for bravery, loyalty, and courtesy, especially toward women. In practice, however, chivalry was a bit more flexible. It was a good ideal to strive for, but they were often just as likely to be fighting over land as they were to be defending the innocent. It was a system that valued military skill above all else. Feudalism and manorialism were the bedrock of medieval society for centuries. They provided a way to organize a society without a strong central government, a way to provide protection in a dangerous world, and a way to ensure that the land, the source of all wealth, was productively used. It was a system built on personal relationships and unwritten rules, and while it might seem chaotic to us today, it was what held Europe together. It was a tough, practical, and highly unequal way to live, but for the people living through it, it was simply the way the world worked. While the Western lands were busy with feudalism and the rise of local lords, the dream of a unified empire didn't completely die. It just moved east, into the lands of the Franks' cousins. After the Carolingian Empire split, the eastern part, the territory that would become modern-day Germany, fractured into a number of powerful duchies. These dukes and princes were all but independent, and the title of king was passed around among them, often with a good deal of fighting and political maneuvering. The system wasn't working very well, and Europe was again facing a new wave of invasions, this time from the Magyars in the east, a nomadic people from Central Asia who were a bit like the Huns, but with a different accent. The dukes needed a strong leader to unite them. In 936, a very capable man named Otto I, a duke from the powerful region of Saxony, was elected king. Otto I, who would come to be known as Otto the Great, was a military genius and a shrewd politician. He defeated the Magyars in a decisive battle at Lechfeld in 945, a victory so significant that it ended their raids and cemented his reputation as a great Christian savior. He then turned his attention to Italy, a land that was still a political mess of warring princes, and he also asserted his authority over the papacy, which had become a bit of a pawn in the local Italian power games. Otto's power was so immense that he was able to go to Rome and, just like Charlemagne before him, have himself crowned emperor by the Pope in 962. This event is seen as the official beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this name is a bit of a historical joke, as one famous philosopher later quipped that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But for the people living at the time, it was a very real and very important political entity. It was an empire that was meant to be the spiritual and political successor to Charlemagne's, and by extension, the old Roman Empire itself. It was a complex and often fractious union of German lands and northern Italy, where the emperor's power was always in a delicate balance with the power of the various dukes, counts, and princes. The emperor was elected by a group of powerful nobles and bishops, known as the electors, so the position wasn't automatically hereditary. This created a situation where the emperor had to constantly negotiate and compromise, which made the empire a little more like a confederation of states than a centralized kingdom. The Holy Roman emperors saw themselves as the protectors of the church and the spiritual leaders of Europe, a role that brought them into constant conflict with the popes. They believed they had the right to appoint bishops and abbots within their own territories, as these church leaders were often powerful political figures and controlled vast lands. This practice, known as lay investiture, would become one of the biggest conflicts of the Middle Ages. Remember that for a later section. Otto and his successors also relied heavily on the church to administer their empire. They would appoint loyal bishops and abbots to key positions, knowing that these men, as celibate clergy, couldn't pass on their land and titles to their children. This was a clever way of ensuring that the emperor's authority remained strong and that the powerful families didn't accumulate too much land and power, a medieval version of term limits for powerful positions. The Holy Roman Empire was a very different beast from the old Roman Empire. It was a German-centric empire with its capital in Aachen, not Rome, and it was a political entity that was deeply intertwined with the church. Its emperors, like the Ottos and the later Hohenstaufens, were constantly trying to consolidate their power, often fighting against rebellious princes in Germany and powerful popes in Rome. It was a kind of high-wire act, trying to balance political power and spiritual authority, and it rarely went smoothly. But despite all the internal conflicts and external threats, the Holy Roman Empire would endure in some form for over 1,000 years, a testament to the enduring power of a good idea, even if it's a bit wobbly in practice. Its creation marked a new chapter in the history of medieval Europe, where the dream of a universal empire was reasserted, but with a new German-centric and Christian identity. The memory of Charlemagne was alive and well, and a new empire had been born to carry on his legacy. While the Holy Roman Empire was taking shape in the east, a pivotal event was brewing to the west, one that would completely reshape the history of England and its relationship with the rest of Europe. This story begins with Edward the Confessor, the penultimate Anglo-Saxon king of England. He was a pious man, but a bit of a political lightweight, and he had a major succession problem. He was childless. As he lay on his deathbed in 1066, a number of ambitious men with some claim to the throne were waiting in the wings. There was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, a man who had served as Edward's chief advisor and was elected king by the Anglo-Saxon nobles upon Edward's death. But there were two other contenders. One was Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, a Viking warrior who claimed the English throne based on an old agreement between his predecessor and a previous English king. The other, and most famous, was William, Duke of Normandy. William was a formidable figure, a tough and experienced ruler who had managed to consolidate his power in Normandy, a duchy in northern France. He was also a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, and he claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years ago, and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath to support his claim. Whether any of this was true is a bit of a historical debate, but William certainly believed it, and he was a man who didn't take broken promises lightly. So in 1066, a year forever etched in the annals of history, England was faced with a three-way battle for the crown. It was like a medieval game of rock, paper, scissors, but with swords and shields. Harold Godwinson, now King Harold II, had to deal with the threats simultaneously. He marched his army north to confront Harold Hardrada, who had landed with a large Viking force. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September 1066, Harold won a decisive victory, killing Hardrada and crushing the last great Viking invasion of England. It was a massive triumph, but it came at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted and had to turn around and march all the way back south, a distance of over 300 kilometers, to face the next and even greater threat. William of Normandy, having built a fleet and a large army of Norman, Breton, and Flemish knights, had crossed the English Channel and landed on the southern coast. He was more than just a duke. He had the blessing of the Pope, who saw Harold as an oath-breaker. On October 14th, 1066, the two armies met at a place now known as Battle, near Hastings. Harold's exhausted but determined Anglo-Saxon army took up a defensive position on a hill, forming a shield wall, a solid line of warriors with overlapping shields that was incredibly difficult to break. William's army, a mix of cavalry, archers, and foot soldiers, attacked the shield wall again and again, but could not break it. The battle raged all day, a brutal back-and-forth affair. It was only when Harold was killed, reportedly struck in the eye by an arrow, though that's a detail that historians still argue over, that the Anglo-Saxon shield wall finally broke, and the Normans were able to win the day. This event, the Battle of Hastings, was a total game-changer. William, now known as William the Conqueror, marched on London and was crowned King of England on Christmas Day. The Norman Conquest was not just a change of kings, it was a profound transformation of English society. William and his Norman followers completely replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility. He confiscated the land from the defeated English lords and distributed it to his loyal followers, creating a new Norman French aristocracy. To keep track of all this new property and to assert his royal authority, he commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a comprehensive survey of all the land and property in England. It was a remarkable document, a kind of medieval census and tax register that gave the king an unprecedented understanding and control of his kingdom. The Conquest also had a huge impact on the English language. The Norman court and nobility spoke a dialect of French, while the common people spoke Old English. Over time, these two languages began to merge, with French words for government, law, and food, like beef and pork, while the animals remained cow and pig, entering the English language. This linguistic blending eventually created Middle English, the language of Shakespeare and Chaucer, which is the direct ancestor of the English we speak today. The Norman Conquest integrated England more closely with continental Europe, bringing it into the political and cultural orbit of France and the wider world. The old Anglo-Saxon way of life was over, and a new Norman French-influenced England was born, a kingdom that would be a major player on the European stage for the rest of history. With the Norman Conquest firmly establishing a new kind of kingdom in England, the stage was set for a different kind of conflict, one that was not fought on a battlefield with swords and shields, but in the halls of power with legal arguments and religious decrees. This was the investiture controversy, a major clash between the two most powerful figures in medieval Europe, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember the Holy Roman Empire we talked about, the one founded by Otto the Great? Its emperors believed they had a right to appoint bishops and abbots within their territories, a practice known as lay investiture. They saw these church officials not just as spiritual leaders, but as powerful landlords and political figures who controlled vast amounts of land and resources. It made perfect sense to them that they, as the rulers of the land, should have a say in who held these important positions. However, the church had a different point of view, and they were beginning to get a little tired of secular rulers treating church offices like political favors. They saw this practice as a corrupting influence, a way for kings and emperors to meddle in the divine affairs of the church and appoint men who were loyal to them, not to God. A reform movement was sweeping through the church, a movement that sought to purify the clergy and reassert the spiritual authority of the Pope. The star of this show was a fiery and ambitious Pope named Gregory VII, who became Pope in 1073. Gregory was a true believer in papal supremacy, the idea that the Pope was the ultimate authority in all matters of faith and morals, and that his authority was even higher than that of kings and emperors. He was not a man to be trifled with. The main opponent in this drama was the young and equally headstrong Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. When Henry appointed a new archbishop for Milan, a major city in northern Italy, without the Pope's consent, Gregory saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. Gregory demanded that Henry revoke the appointment, and when Henry refused, Gregory took the ultimate step. He excommunicated Henry. Now, this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Excommunication was a very big deal. It meant that Henry was officially kicked out of the church. He couldn't receive the sacraments, and more importantly, it released all of his subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. In the deeply religious world of the Middle Ages, this was a political death sentence. Henry's German princes, who were already a bit rebellious, saw this as a perfect opportunity to overthrow him. Faced with a rebellion and the loss of his authority, Henry had to act quickly. In a famous and dramatic scene, he traveled all the way to a castle in the snowy mountains of Canossa, Italy, in the winter of 1077. There, he stood outside the castle gates for 3 days, barefoot and dressed in sackcloth like a common penitent. He was a Holy Roman Emperor, and he was begging for the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory, a savvy politician, kept him waiting, enjoying the spectacle and the public display of his power. Finally, on the 4th day, he relented and lifted the excommunication. The image of the most powerful secular ruler in Europe, humbling himself before the Pope, became a powerful symbol of the Church's authority. Now, this wasn't the end of the story. The conflict continued for decades, with both sides appointing rival popes and anti-popes. The fighting was messy and bloody, and it was a major distraction for the rulers of Europe. The struggle was finally resolved, at least for a time, with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. This agreement was a compromise. It stated that the Church would have the exclusive right to choose and consecrate bishops and abbots, but that the emperor would have the right to be present at the election and to grant the new bishop or abbot their symbols of secular power, like land and titles. It was a kind of separation of church and state, a recognition that both spiritual and secular authority had their own distinct spheres. The investiture controversy was a hugely important moment in European history. It redefined the relationship between the church and secular rulers, and it established the papacy as a powerful, independent political force. The Pope was no longer just the spiritual leader of the church. He was a major player on the European stage, a figure who could challenge the authority of even the most powerful kings and emperors. It set the precedent for the idea that the church had its own authority, separate and distinct from that of the state, an idea that continues to resonate today. The controversy reshaped the balance of power and made medieval Europe a place where spiritual and temporal authority were in a constant and often violent dance. With the papacy's authority now firmly established after the investiture controversy, the church was ready for its next great act on the world stage. And this one was a big one. It was a call to arms, a divine mission, a grand adventure that would forever change the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. It began in 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a huge crowd at the Council of Clermont in France and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in all of history. The air was electric with anticipation, the crowd a mix of nobles, knights, and commoners. Urban painted a dire picture of the state of the Holy Land. The Seljuk Turks, a new and powerful Muslim dynasty, had recently captured Jerusalem, and Christian pilgrims were being harassed and prevented from visiting the holy sites. Urban's message was simple and powerful. God wills it. He called upon the Christian warriors of Europe to lay aside their petty squabbles and march to the east to liberate Jerusalem. He promised them that their sins would be forgiven and that they would win eternal salvation. It was a deal that was too good to pass up. Fight for God, get into heaven. What could be better? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of knights, from the great lords of France and Italy to the landless younger sons of noblemen, took the cross, a symbol of their holy pilgrimage. But it wasn't just the knights. A huge, disorganized, and enthusiastic mob of commoners, led by a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, also took up the cause. This was the People's Crusade, and it was a bit of a disaster. The group was poorly armed and had no idea what they were doing. They massacred Jewish communities in Europe along the way and were almost completely wiped out by the Turks as soon as they reached Anatolia. The knights, however, were a more professional bunch. They organized themselves into several large armies, and in a logistical marvel for the time, began the long, dangerous journey east. This was the First Crusade, a military expedition unlike any before it. It wasn't a national army, but a collection of different feudal armies from across Europe, all united by a single, powerful religious goal. They faced incredible hardships on the way, a lack of food and water, disease, and constant skirmishes with local populations. But they persevered, laying siege to the city of Antioch, one of the most important cities in the Middle East. The siege lasted for months, a grueling test of endurance, but they eventually captured the city in 1098. Their ultimate prize, however, was still ahead. In 1099, the Crusaders have finally reached the walls of Jerusalem. The city, though well defended, was weakened by internal conflicts, and the Crusaders, with a renewed sense of purpose, launched a final, brutal assault. The city fell, and what followed was a massacre. The Crusaders, in their religious zeal, slaughtered almost every Muslim and Jewish inhabitant of the city. It was a dark, terrible moment, a stain on the memory of an otherwise holy mission. After the conquest, the Crusaders didn't just go home. They established a number of Christian states in the Middle East, known as the Crusader states. The most important of these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a sort of medieval European kingdom plopped down in the middle of a completely different culture. They built magnificent castles, like the famous Croix des Chevaliers, to defend their new territories and maintain their fragile hold on power. They established new institutions, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, religious military orders of monks who were also warriors, dedicated to protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. The Crusader states were always on shaky ground, surrounded by a much larger and often hostile Muslim population. They were a sort of historical anomaly, a piece of Europe that had been transplanted to Asia, and they were in a constant struggle for survival. The First Crusade was a huge success from a Christian perspective. They had captured the Holy Land and established a European presence in the Middle East, but it also had far-reaching and often negative consequences. It deepened the rift between the Eastern and Western churches, as the Crusaders often showed little respect for the Byzantine Empire and its people. It also created a lasting legacy of distrust and hostility between Christians and Muslims, a legacy that would have a huge impact for centuries to come. The Crusades also had a major impact on Europe itself. They stimulated trade, as Europeans now had a direct route to the goods of the East, like spices and silk. They also led to a new kind of social mobility. A knight who had been a landless younger son in Europe could now become a powerful lord in the Crusader states. The First Crusade was a defining moment of the Middle Ages, a moment when the religious and military energies of Europe came together in a spectacular and often brutal display of power and faith. The success of the First Crusade was a powerful demonstration of the Church's influence, and it ushered in an era where the papacy became one of the dominant forces in European politics. The investiture controversy had already shown that the Pope was a political heavyweight, but the Crusades took it to another level entirely. The Pope was no longer just the spiritual leader of the Christian world. He was the head of a sort of international coalition, a figure who could command armies and direct the course of European history. This period, known as the High Middle Ages, saw the papacy reach the absolute peak of its power and authority. It was a time when the Pope's word could make or break kings, and when the Church's influence permeated every aspect of daily life, from the cradle to the grave. The man most associated with this surge in papal power was Pope Innocent III, who served from 1198 to 1216. He was one of the most powerful popes in history, a man who saw himself as the vicar of Christ on earth, a title that implied a kind of divine authority over all secular rulers. He famously declared that the Pope was set between God and man, lower than God, but higher than man. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He excommunicated and placed entire kingdoms under an interdict, a powerful tool that essentially forbade all religious services within a kingdom, which was a very big deal in a deeply religious society. He used this power to force the kings of England and France to bend to his will. When King John of England challenged him over the appointment of an archbishop, Innocent placed England under an interdict, and King John had no choice but to back down and even declare England a feudal fief of the papacy. It was a stunning display of power, a kind of papal checkmate. Innocent III also organized the Fourth Crusade, which in a bizarre and tragic twist of historical fate ended up sacking the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204. The Crusaders, who had originally set out for Jerusalem, were diverted by Venetian merchants in a complicated political drama in the Byzantine Empire. They plundered the great city, looted its treasures, and brought an end to over 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. The event was a massive black eye for the papacy, and it cemented the final split between the Western and Eastern churches. Innocent III also presided over the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, one of the most important councils in church history. The council laid down new rules for the church, including a requirement for all Christians to confess their sins and receive communion at least once a year. It also defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that during the Eucharist, the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ. It was a massive effort to standardize and consolidate Christian doctrine and practice across all of Europe. But the papacy's power wasn't just about politics and doctrine, it was also about money. The church was a vast and wealthy institution, and it collected taxes from all over Europe, a kind of medieval income tax that was known as the tithe. They also sold indulgences, which were a sort of certificate that promised to reduce the amount of time a person would have to spend in purgatory for their sins. It was a very lucrative business, and it became a source of major controversy and corruption later on. The church also had its own court system, known as the ecclesiastical courts, which heard cases that involved clergy members or issues related to marriage, wills, and heresy. This gave the church a legal authority that was often in conflict with the authority of the secular kings. The rise of papal power had a profound impact on the culture and society of the Middle Ages. It gave Europe a shared sense of religious identity and purpose, and it provided a moral and legal framework that transcended national borders. The Pope was seen as the spiritual father of all of Christendom, and his authority was a source of stability in a world that was often chaotic. However, it also led to a lot of conflict, as popes and kings fought for supremacy. It created a situation where the church was deeply involved in secular affairs, and this involvement, with its vast wealth and power, often led to corruption and moral decay. The great and powerful papacy was a double-edged sword, a source of both strength and weakness for the medieval world. It was a time when the spiritual and the political were so intertwined that it was often impossible to tell where one began and the other ended. While the great powers of Europe were busy with crusades and papal politics, life on the ground for most people was defined by the walls of a different kind of institution, the medieval castle. These weren't just big, fancy houses for the rich. They were the nerve centers of the feudal system, a lord's home, a military fortress, and the administrative hub for the surrounding lands. The design of the castle evolved over time, starting from simple motte and bailey structures, a wooden fort on a dirt mound surrounded by a courtyard, to the massive, stone-walled fortresses that we all picture when we hear the word castle. The transition to stone was a huge technological leap, making them much more resistant to fire and siege weapons. Castles weren't just built to look impressive. Every part had a specific defensive purpose. The high stone walls, or curtain walls, were often topped with battlements, providing cover for archers and defenders. The gates were protected by a portcullis, a heavy iron grille that could be dropped in an instant, and a drawbridge over a deep, wide ditch called a moat. The main tower, or keep, was the last line of defense, a stronghold where the lord and his family could retreat if the outer defenses were breached. Life inside the castle was a strange mix of the grand and the squalid. For the lord and his family, it was a life of relative comfort and power. They ate well, though medieval food was often a bit bland by modern standards, and they had servants to take care of their every need. Their days were filled with hunting, feasting, and managing the affairs of the manor. The great hall was the heart of the castle, a huge room where the lord would hold court, entertain guests, and eat his meals. At night, everyone, from the lord to the servants, often slept in the same hall, with the lord and his family having a separate, more private chamber. The air was often thick with smoke from the central fireplace and the smells of unwashed bodies and dogs running around. It was a bustling, crowded, and not always very sanitary place. The castle's population was a mini society in itself. There was the lord, of course, and his family, but there were also knights, who served as the lord's personal bodyguard and military force. There were servants and cooks, blacksmiths and carpenters, and the ever-present clergy, a chaplain who would hold Mass in the castle's chapel. Life was dictated by the seasons and the cycle of religious festivals. Work was constant, and leisure was rare, mostly consisting of feast days and religious celebrations. The lord of the castle was responsible for the protection of all the people on his manor, from the knights to the serfs. In return, they owed him their loyalty and service. The castle was the physical manifestation of this feudal contract, a symbol of power and protection that stood above the surrounding village and fields. Sieges were a constant threat to castles, and the art of siege warfare evolved over time. Early castles were often taken by a simple strategy: starve them out. But as the castles became more sophisticated, so did the siege engines used to attack them. There were trebuchets, giant catapults that could hurl huge stones over the walls, and battering rams to smash through the gates. The defenders, in turn, had their own tricks. They would pour boiling oil or pitch from the battlements, or they would use their own catapults to hurl rocks back at the attackers. Sieges were long, brutal affairs, often lasting for months, and they were a testament to the fact that even the most formidable fortress could eventually fall. One of the most famous medieval castles is the Tower of London, a formidable fortress that served as a royal residence, a prison, and a treasury. Its construction was begun by William the Conqueror after the Battle of Hastings, a physical symbol of his power and his determination to keep the English in line. It's a great example of how castles were both practical defenses and powerful political statements. Another great example is the Castle of Carcassonne in France, a massive double-walled fortress that looks like something straight out of a fairy tale. These structures weren't just military strongholds, they were also works of art and testaments to the incredible engineering skills of the Middle Ages. Historians still argue whether medieval castles were ultimately a force for good or a source of endless warfare. They provided protection and stability in a chaotic world, but they also enabled powerful lords to oppress their subjects and wage war on their neighbors. They were a complex symbol of a complex age. While the countryside was organized around the lord and his castle, a new kind of social and economic life was beginning to flourish in the growing towns and cities of Europe. The Crusades, in particular, had a huge impact on this revival of urban life. As knights and nobles traveled to the Holy Land, they saw the vibrant, wealthy cities of the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East, with their bustling marketplaces and long-distance trade. They brought back a taste for new goods, spices, silks, and exotic luxuries, which in turn created a demand for more trade and new routes to get those goods back to Europe. This renewed interest in commerce began to transform the sleepy, agricultural economy of the feudal world. The first towns often grew up around a castle or a monastery, places that offered a degree of protection. Others were founded at key locations, such as a river crossing or a major trade route. These towns were a refuge from the manorial system, a place where a serf who could escape and live for a year and a day without being caught could become a free man. This simple rule, often summarized by the phrase, "town air makes you free," was a powerful incentive for people to leave the land and seek a new life. As towns grew, They began to demand more freedom from the local lord or king. They wanted the right to govern themselves, to have their own courts, and to collect their own taxes. The king, often in need of money for his own wars and projects, would grant them a charter in exchange for a large sum of money. This charter was a legal document that gave the town a degree of autonomy and self-governance. It was a crucial step in the development of a new kind of power, one that was not based on land and military service, but on wealth and commerce. At the heart of this new urban economy were the guilds. These were professional associations of merchants and artisans, and they were the most powerful institutions in a medieval town. There were two main types of guilds, the merchant guilds and the craft guilds. The merchant guilds were made up of the most powerful and wealthy traders. They controlled the town's trade, set prices, and ensured that no one from outside the guild could compete with them. They were a bit like a medieval version of a chamber of commerce and a cartel all rolled into one. The craft guilds, on the other hand, were for specific trades, like bakers, blacksmiths, weavers, and shoemakers. The guild system was a way of ensuring quality and controlling competition. To become a master craftsman, a person had to go through a long process. They would start as an apprentice, living and working with a master for several years to learn the trade. After that, they would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who was paid for his labor and could travel from town to work for different masters. Finally, if they could create a masterpiece, a work of art that demonstrated their skill, and it was approved by the masters, they could become a master craftsman themselves and then open their own shop. This system created a kind of medieval quality control, ensuring that the goods produced were of a high standard. The growth of towns and guilds led to the creation of a new social class, the burghers or the town dwellers. These were not nobles or clergy, and they were not peasants or serfs. They were a new kind of free man, a class of merchants, artisans, and professionals whose wealth and power came from commerce, not from land. They built beautiful town halls, magnificent cathedrals, and bustling market squares. They created a vibrant cultural and intellectual life that was very different from the rural, agricultural world of the manor. The towns were a source of new ideas, new technologies, and new forms of social organization. They were a dynamic force that would eventually challenge the old feudal order and lay the groundwork for a more modern society. Historians still argue whether the revival of towns was a cause or a consequence of the new prosperity in Europe. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Did towns grow because there was more trade, or did the growth of towns create more trade? Regardless of the cause, the effect was clear. The towns were a new and powerful force in medieval Europe. They were a beacon of freedom and opportunity, a place where a person's fate was not determined by their birth, but by their skills and their ambition. The revival of urban life was one of the most important developments of the Middle Ages, a silent revolution that was slowly but surely transforming the very fabric of European society. The success of the First Crusade, which resulted in the capture of Jerusalem, was a truly remarkable feat, but the Crusader states it created were always on a knife's edge. Surrounded by much more powerful Muslim neighbors, these kingdoms were in a constant state of war, and they needed reinforcements from Europe just to survive. So when the city of Edessa, one of the first Crusader states, fell to Muslim forces in 1144, it sent shockwaves back to Europe. The papacy and the great rulers of Europe realized that if they didn't act, the entire project of the Crusades might fail. This led to the launch of the Second Crusade in 1147, and it was a very different affair from the first. This time, it was led by two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. This was a full-scale royal expedition, not a collection of independent lords, but it ended in complete failure. The two armies, traveling separately, were almost completely wiped out in Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks, and the attempt to take Damascus, a major Muslim stronghold, was a total bust. The Second Crusade was a major disappointment, a stark reminder that even with the backing of kings, the Holy Land was a very difficult place to conquer and hold. But the story of the Crusades wasn't over. In the late 12th century, a new and powerful force emerged in the Muslim world: Saladin, a brilliant general and sultan who had united the Muslim states of Egypt and Syria. Saladin was a formidable opponent, a chivalrous warrior who was a master of both warfare and diplomacy. He saw it as his divine mission to drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, and in 1187 he succeeded. His army captured Jerusalem after a short siege, and he did it without the massacre that had accompanied the city's fall to the Crusaders a century earlier. This loss of Jerusalem was a complete shock to Europe, and it led to the launch of the most famous of all the Crusades, the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade, which ran from 1189 to 1192, was a truly all-star cast of medieval rulers. The three most powerful kings in Europe took the cross: Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor, a legendary figure who was also known as Barbarossa because of his magnificent red beard; Philip II of France, a wily and ambitious king who was busy consolidating his power; and Richard I of England, also known as the Lionheart, a charismatic and brilliant military leader who was the quintessential knight-errant. Each of these kings led a huge army, but the expedition was plagued with bad luck and infighting. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river on the way, a ridiculously mundane end for such a larger-than-life figure. Philip II and Richard I, who were already political rivals back in Europe, bickered constantly, and Philip eventually went home early. That left Richard the Lionheart to lead the crusade alone. Richard I was a military genius, and he was able to win a number of stunning victories against Saladin's forces. He recaptured the port city of Acre and won a decisive battle at Arsuf. His campaigns were a masterclass in medieval logistics and strategy, and his bravery and military prowess were legendary even in the Muslim world. But he was never able to recapture Jerusalem. Saladin, with his superior numbers and a firm grasp of the local geography, was able to hold the city against Richard's forces. In the end, Richard and Saladin, two of the greatest military minds of the age, signed a truce. The Crusaders got to keep a strip of land along the coast and had the right to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but the city itself remained in Muslim hands. The Third Crusade was a mixed bag, a military success, but a strategic failure. It showed that even the greatest kings of Europe could not hold the Holy Land, and it set the stage for a new kind of crusade, one that was less about conquest and more about trade and political maneuvering. Historians still debate which of the two leaders, Saladin or Richard, was the more impressive. Saladin was a unifier and a brilliant diplomat who brought the Muslim world together. Richard was a tactical genius who was able to win battles against a much larger force. They were two sides of the same coin, two legendary figures whose rivalry defined an era. While the kings and popes were busy with their grand crusades, a quieter but equally profound revolution was taking place in the halls of learning across Europe. This period, from roughly the 12th century onwards, is often called the High Middle Ages Renaissance. It wasn't a sudden explosion of art and science like the more famous Renaissance that would come later, but a slow, steady flowering of intellectual and cultural life. The catalyst for this revival was the reintroduction of a huge body of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge that had been lost to the West for centuries. This knowledge came flooding back into Europe through two main channels: the Muslim world in Spain and Sicily, where scholars had preserved and built upon the works of ancient thinkers like Aristotle, and the Byzantine Empire in the East. Scholars in these places had translated these texts from Greek into Arabic and Latin, and now European scholars were devouring them. It was like finding a whole library of lost books, and it completely changed the way people thought. This new intellectual energy led to the rise of the universities. Before this time, education was mostly centered in monasteries and cathedral schools. But in the 12th century, groups of scholars and students began to gather in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, forming the first true universities. These were a new kind of institution, a sort of medieval think tank, where scholars could debate and discuss the big questions of the day. The word university itself comes from the Latin universitas, meaning a guild or corporation of masters and students. These universities were often run by the scholars themselves, not by a king or a bishop, which gave them a degree of intellectual freedom. Students came from all over Europe to study the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And the most advanced students would go on to study law, medicine, or theology. The universities were a huge deal, a place where people could think critically and debate new ideas. They were a sort of medieval internet, a hub of knowledge and communication that connected scholars from all over the continent. At the heart of this intellectual revival was a new school of thought known as scholasticism. Scholasticism was a method of thinking that tried to reconcile the newly rediscovered Greek philosophy, particularly the logic of Aristotle, with the teachings of the Christian Church. It was an attempt to use reason to prove and understand the truths of faith. The most famous scholastic thinker was Thomas Aquinas, an Italian Dominican friar and theologian. His great work, the Summa Theologica, was a monumental effort to synthesize Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy. He used a logical question and answer format to explore everything from the existence of God to the nature of good and evil. Aquinas argued that faith and reason were not at odds with each other, but were two different paths to the same truth. His work became the bedrock of Catholic theology, and it showed that it was possible to be both a pious Christian and a rigorous intellectual. The intellectual revival also had a profound impact on art and architecture. This period saw the rise of the magnificent Gothic cathedrals that still dominate the skylines of many European cities. Unlike the earlier, heavy and dark Romanesque churches, Gothic cathedrals were all about light and height. They were engineering marvels, with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, which allowed for thinner walls and huge stained glass windows that filled the interiors with a kaleidoscope of colored light. They were meant to be a physical representation of heaven on earth, a place that would inspire awe and reverence in the faithful. They were also a reflection of the new urban prosperity, as towns competed to build the tallest and most beautiful cathedral. It was a kind of medieval space race, but with churches instead of rockets. Historians still argue whether this period was a true Renaissance or just an extension of the existing medieval world. The term itself is a bit anachronistic, but there's no doubt that the 12th and 13th centuries were a time of immense cultural and intellectual change. The rediscovery of ancient knowledge, the rise of the universities, the development of scholasticism, and the constructions of the Gothic cathedrals all point to a world that was becoming more complex, more sophisticated, and more confident in its own intellectual abilities. It was a golden age of thought and building, a time when Europe was starting to realize its full potential. Just as the High Middle Ages were reaching their intellectual and cultural peak, a new and terrifying force emerged from the vast steppes of Central Asia, one that would send shockwaves across the world and leave an indelible mark on the history of Europe. This was the Mongol Empire, a nomadic people who, under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Genghis Khan, had created the largest contiguous land empire in all of history. The Mongols were a truly formidable military force, masters of the bow and the horse, and their armies were organized with a terrifying efficiency. They moved with a speed that was unheard of in the medieval world, and their reputation for brutality and conquest preceded them, causing panic and fear wherever they went. The first major European encounter with the Mongols came in the early 13th century. After conquering China and much of Central Asia, a Mongol army, led by Genghis Khan's grandson Batu Khan, turned their attention west. In 1240, they stormed and sacked the great city of Kiev, which was the capital of the first Russian state that had been founded by the Vikings we mentioned earlier. It was a devastating blow, and it led to the almost complete subjugation of the Russian principalities. For the next 2.5 centuries, the Mongols, or their successors, the Golden Horde, would rule over Russia, a period of foreign domination that would have a huge and lasting impact on Russian history and culture. The Mongols, however, did not just stop at Russia. They continued their advance, pushing into Poland, Hungary, and other parts of Central Europe, defeating the forces sent to stop them with a kind of overwhelming speed and tactical genius that medieval European armies were simply not prepared for. The Mongols were at the gates of Vienna and were poised to invade the rest of Western Europe. It seemed as though nothing could stop them. But then, a very fortunate, if somewhat tragic event happened for the Europeans. The Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, died in 1241. This triggered a succession crisis, and the Mongol generals, according to their customs, had to return to Mongolia to elect a new leader. This sudden withdrawal gave Europe a reprieve, and the Mongols never again launched a full-scale invasion of Western Europe. It was a close call, a sort of historical dodgeball, where Europe was about to get hit with the ball, but the throwers suddenly had to go home. The impact of the Mongol invasions on Europe was complex, and in some ways, contradictory. On the one hand, they caused immense destruction and a great deal of fear. The Mongols' military tactics, which included psychological warfare and a scorched earth policy, were horrifying to the people they conquered. But on the other hand, the vast Mongol Empire created a sort of Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, that stretched across Eurasia. This period of relative stability allowed for the free flow of goods, ideas, and people from China to Europe, something that had never happened before on such a scale. European traders, like the famous Marco Polo, were able to travel all the way to China and back, opening up a new world of commerce and knowledge. New technologies, like gunpowder and the compass, and new ideas, like paper money and diplomatic passports, made their way from the east to the west. The Mongol invasions, therefore, were both a cataclysmic event and a sort of historical superhighway that connected Europe to the rest of the world. The Mongol threat also, ironically, had the effect of forcing the European kingdoms to become more organized and unified. The kings of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, seeing what happened to Russia, realized that they needed to be able to raise large professional armies and not just rely on the feudal levies of their nobles. This fear of an external threat was one of the factors that helped to strengthen the power of the national monarchies and consolidate their control over their kingdoms. Historians still argue about whether the Mongols were primarily a destructive force or a catalyst for global connectivity. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a bit of both. They were a terrifying reminder of the fragility of civilization, but they also inadvertently helped to lay the groundwork for the globalized world that would come after them. They were a powerful and deeply unsettling interlude in the story of medieval Europe. With the Mongol threat receding, the great powers of Europe were free to return to their own squabbles, and there was no squabble bigger or longer lasting than the one between England and France. This epic conflict, which stretched on for over a century, is known as the 100 Years' War. The name is a bit of a misnomer, as it was really a series of wars and not one continuous conflict, but it does a good job of capturing the long, drawn-out nature of the struggle. The origins of the war were a complex knot of feudal law, family rivalries, and competing claims to the French throne. Remember the Norman Conquest? Since that time, the English kings, who were still technically dukes of Normandy and other French territories, held vast lands in France. This created a very awkward situation where the King of England was a vassal of the King of France, even though he was a powerful king in his own right. It was a kind of medieval political nightmare, a situation just waiting to explode. The spark that finally ignited the war came in 1328, when the French king died without a male heir. The closest male relative was King Edward III of England, who claimed the French throne through his mother. The French nobility, however, weren't very keen on the idea of being ruled by an English king, so they chose a French nobleman, Philip VI, as their new king. Edward III, being a proud and ambitious king, declared war. The first phase of the war, which lasted for over 20 years, saw the English win a number of stunning victories, even though they were often outnumbered. The secret to their success was the longbow, a powerful new weapon that could fire arrows with a much greater range and force than the crossbows used by the French. English archers, with their incredible training and discipline, were able to unleash a storm of arrows that could cut through the ranks of the French cavalry and overwhelm their infantry. One of the most famous battles of this era was the Battle of Crecy in 1346. Edward III's army, which was much smaller than the French force, took up a defensive position on a hill. The French, confident in their numbers and their chivalric ideals, launched a series of disorganized charges against the English lines. The English longbowmen, protected by stakes in the ground, unleashed a devastating volley of arrows, and the French cavalry was mowed down before they could even reach the English lines. The battle was a complete disaster for the French nobility, and it shattered the myth of the invincible mounted knight. It showed that a well-disciplined infantry, with the right technology, could defeat a much larger force. It was a sort of medieval paradigm shift in warfare. A decade later, in 1356, the English repeated their success at the Battle of Poitiers. This time, the English army was led by Edward III's son, Edward, the Black Prince, a legendary figure in his own right. The English were once again outnumbered, but they were able to use their longbowmen and a series of clever tactical maneuvers to defeat the French army and, in an almost unbelievable turn of events, capture the French king himself, King John II. It was a massive political coup, and it forced the French to sign a very unfavorable peace treaty. The English, in this early phase of the war, were having a grand old time. The longbow was proving to be the ultimate medieval cheat code, and the French seemed to have no answer for it. However, the war wasn't just fought with bows and arrows. It was also fought with sieges, raids, and a lot of political intrigue. The French, for their part, eventually learned to avoid open field battles and instead focused on a strategy of attrition, raiding English-held territories and wearing down their forces. They also built up their own navy, so they could challenge the English for control of the English Channel. It was a long, brutal, and destructive war that brought a lot of misery to the people of France. It led to the rise of professional armies and a decline in the importance of the feudal knight, who was now seen as a bit old-fashioned and a little too easily defeated by a hail of arrows. The 100 Years' War was a sort of historical laboratory where the future of warfare was being forged, a future that was less about noble duels and more about disciplined soldiers with new, powerful weapons. But it was only the first part of the story. Just as Europe was settling into the long, drawn-out grind of the 100 Years' War, an enemy far more deadly and indiscriminate than any army appeared on the horizon. This was the Black Death, a devastating plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, leaving a trail of death and destruction unlike anything seen before. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and it arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by fleas on rats that were traveling on merchant ships from Asia. The ships, often sailing without anyone aboard, knowing they were carrying a biological weapon, docked at ports in Sicily and Italy, and from there, the disease spread with a horrifying speed. It was a kind of medieval globalization, but with a terrible price. The plague manifested in three main forms. There was the bubonic plague, which caused painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, hence the name, in the groin, armpit, and neck. There was the pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and was spread through the air by coughing, and it was almost always fatal. And there was the septicemic plague, which infected the blood and was also universally fatal. The symptoms were gruesome and terrifying, and the death toll was immense. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but it's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe died in just a few short years. Entire towns and villages were wiped out, and the stench of death hung over the continent. The plague didn't care if you were a king or a peasant, a bishop or a blacksmith. It killed everyone with a cold, relentless indifference. The social and economic consequences of the Black Death were profound and transformative. With so many people dying, there was a massive labor shortage. This was a huge deal for the feudal system, which was based on the idea that there was always a surplus of peasant labor. Now suddenly, the remaining peasants were in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom. Lords, who had lost most of their serfs, were now competing for a much smaller pool of laborers, and this led to the final, slow decay of the manorial system. It was a kind of historical irony, a terrible tragedy that for the surviving poor actually led to a better life. The plague was a bit of a reset button for the entire medieval economic system. The Black Death also had a huge impact on the church. In the face of so much death and suffering, people turned to the church for answers, but the church often had none. Priests and monks, who were often on the front lines of the disease, died in huge numbers, and the church was forced to replace them with less educated and less experienced clergy. People began to lose faith in the institution, believing that God had either abandoned them or that the church was not able to save them. This loss of faith, coupled with the new sense of social mobility, led to a more questioning and independent-minded population. People started to look for answers outside of the traditional religious and political structures, a trend that would have huge implications for the future. The plague also had a significant cultural and artistic impact. The art and literature of the time became obsessed with death and mortality. We see this in the popular artistic motif of the danse macabre, or the dance of death, where skeletons lead people of all social classes, from popes to kings to peasants, to their graves. It was a powerful reminder that death was the great equalizer, and that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could escape it. The plague also led to a new kind of fatalism and a focus on living in the moment, as people realized that their lives could be cut short at any time. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of the Black Death. Some see it as a necessary evil that broke the back of the feudal system and paved the way for a more modern society. Others see it as a terrible, destructive event that set Europe back for centuries. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Black Death was a horrifying tragedy that killed millions, but it also, in a strange and terrible way, helped to create a new kind of world, one with a more fluid social structure, a more questioning population, and a new kind of economy. It was a truly transformative event, a moment of profound darkness that ironically gave birth to a new kind of light. In the midst of the chaos and upheaval of the High Middle Ages, plague, warfare, and political intrigue, there was one institution that, for all its flaws, provided a constant and enduring presence: the Church. And at the heart of the Church's mission were the religious orders and the system of monasticism. These were communities of men and women, monks and nuns, who dedicated their lives to God, living a life of prayer, work, and study. This tradition began in the early Christian world, but it was in the Middle Ages that it truly came into its own, providing a vital source of stability, knowledge, and social welfare in a world that was often unstable. The first great monastic order was the Benedictines, founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. His rule, a practical guide for monastic life, became the standard for monasteries all over Europe. The rule was a simple one: a balance of prayer, work, and sleep. Monks spent their days in communal prayer, in the work of the monastery, farming, brewing beer, and making things, and in the quiet solitude of study and spiritual contemplation. Their motto was ora et labora, or pray and work. Monasteries were not just places of spiritual devotion, they were also centers of learning. Monks painstakingly copied ancient manuscripts, both religious and secular, in the scriptorium, a special room for writing. It was in these quiet halls that the knowledge of the ancient world was preserved, a kind of medieval backup system for all of human history. As the Middle Ages progressed, new orders were founded, each with its own specific mission. The Cistercians, for example, were a reform movement that sought to return to a stricter, simpler form of monasticism. They built their monasteries in remote, rural areas and focused on hard manual labor and a life of austerity. They were also brilliant farmers and engineers, draining swamps, building mills, and innovating new agricultural techniques. They were a kind of medieval farming cooperative, and their economic impact was huge. But not all religious life was lived behind the walls of a monastery. In the 13th century, a new kind of religious order emerged: the mendicant orders, or the begging orders. These were not monks who lived a life of quiet contemplation. They were friars who went out into the world to preach and serve the poor. The two most famous mendicant orders were the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Franciscans were founded by Saint Francis of Assisi, a man who famously renounced his wealthy family to live a life of poverty and service. His message was a simple one: love God, love your neighbor, and live a life of simplicity and humility. The Franciscans, or Little Brothers, as they called themselves, went out into the bustling towns and cities of Europe, where they preached, cared for the sick, and begged for their food. They were a sort of spiritual first responders, bringing the message of the gospel directly to the common people. The Dominicans, or the Order of Preachers, were founded by Saint Dominic, and their mission was to combat heresy and preach a clear, orthodox message. They were a highly educated order, and they became some of the most famous and influential scholars of the Middle Ages, with members like Thomas Aquinas being a shining example. They were the intellectuals of the church, the ones who went out and debated new ideas and defended the faith with logic and reason. The religious orders and the monastic system had a profound impact on medieval society. They provided a place of refuge for the poor, the sick, and the uneducated. They were the hospitals, the orphanages, and the libraries of their time. They were also a source of great wealth and power. Monasteries owned vast amounts of land, and the abbots and abbesses were powerful political figures in their own right. This wealth, however, often led to corruption and a departure from the original ideals of simplicity and poverty, a problem that would lead to later reform movements. But for the most part, the monks and friars of the Middle Ages were a force for good, a testament to the idea that a life of service and devotion could be a powerful force for change. They were the backbone of the medieval church, the quiet heroes who preserved knowledge, cared for the poor, and kept the spiritual flame of Europe alive. After the relative quiet of the mendicant orders and the philosophical debates of the universities, the 100 Years' War roared back to life in the 15th century, and this time it would be marked by a dramatic turn of events and the emergence of a truly legendary figure. The first phase of the war, as we remember, had been a series of English victories, culminating in the capture of the French king. But in the early 15th century, with a new English king, Henry V, on the throne, the war entered a new and even more brutal phase. Henry V, a brilliant and charismatic military leader, decided to press his claim to the French throne with renewed vigor. He landed in France with a relatively small army, and in 1415 won a stunning and famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt. Agincourt was a repeat of Crécy and Poitiers, but on an even grander scale. The French, once again confident in their numerical superiority and their chivalric ideals, launched a massive charge against the English army, which was bogged down in a muddy field. The English longbowmen, with their devastating volleys of arrows, were able to completely break the French charge, and the English knights, on foot, were able to slaughter the dismounted French nobility. It was a complete and utter catastrophe for the French, a moment of national humiliation. Henry V, capitalizing on his victory, was able to conquer large parts of northern France, and in 1420 forced the French king to sign a treaty that made Henry V the heir to the French throne. It looked like the 100 Years' War was over, and the English had won. But Henry V died just a few years later, and the French, in a fit of national pride, refused to accept an English king. The war continued, but the French were on the ropes, and it seemed as though their defeat was only a matter of time. Then, in 1429, a new and unexpected force appeared on the scene, Joan of Arc. She was just a teenage peasant girl from a remote village, but she claimed to have been visited by saints and angels who told her that she had a divine mission to save France and to see the rightful French king, the Dauphin Charles, crowned at Reims. At first, the French court was skeptical, but the situation was so dire that they decided to take a chance on her. Joan, dressed in armor and carrying a banner, led the French army to a stunning victory at the Siege of Orleans. a pivotal moment that broke the English siege of the city and completely turned the tide of the war. Her presence, a sort of divine endorsement of the French cause, galvanized the French army and the French people. She was a symbol of hope, a physical manifestation of a national spirit that had been beaten down by decades of defeat. Joan's victories were a remarkable series of events. She led the French army to a number of other victories and was even able to see the Dauphin crowned King Charles VII at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. She had fulfilled her mission, but her story ended in tragedy. She was captured by the Burgundians, who were allies of the English, and sold to the English. In 1431, she was put on trial by a pro-English ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy and witchcraft. She was found guilty, and at the young age of 19 was burned at the stake. Her death, however, didn't stop the French resurgence. The French, now with a new sense of national pride and a professional army, were able to continue the fight. They adopted new tactics and new technology, particularly cannons, which were much more effective at breaching the walls of the English-held castles. The English, for their part, were plagued by internal political conflicts, which made it difficult for them to send reinforcements. The war finally came to an end in 1453, a full 116 years after it had begun. The French were victorious, and the English had lost all of their territories in France, save for a small port city. The 100 Years' War was a truly transformative conflict. It helped to forge a new sense of French national identity, a feeling of being French that was stronger than any regional or feudal loyalties. It also led to the decline of the feudal knight and the rise of the professional soldier and the national army. The war, which began with a medieval dispute over feudal claims, ended with the creation of two new, powerful nation-states, England and France. It was a long, brutal journey, but it was one that laid the groundwork for the modern world. The 100 Years' War was a political and military disaster for much of Europe, but it was nothing compared to the self-inflicted wound that the Church was about to endure. For centuries, the papacy had been a central and unifying force in Christendom, a spiritual and political powerhouse. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, a series of events would completely shatter its authority and leave the faithful deeply disillusioned. The trouble started in 1309, when the French king, Philip IV, managed to exert his influence over the papacy and get a French pope elected, who then moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city on the border of France. This period, known as the Avignon Papacy, lasted for nearly 70 years, and it was a source of great scandal for many Europeans, who saw the Pope as a kind of puppet of the French king. It was a bit like having the head of a major international corporation move his headquarters to his biggest competitor's backyard. It just didn't look good. The Avignon Papacy finally came to an end in 1377 when Pope Gregory XV decided to move the papal court back to Rome. But when he died a year later, a new and even bigger problem emerged. The cardinals, under pressure from a Roman mob, elected an Italian pope, Urban VI. He turned out to be a bit of a hothead, and the French cardinals, who were not happy with his leadership, went off and elected their own pope, Clement VII, who set up his own court back in Avignon. And just like that, the Church had two popes. This was the beginning of the Great Schism of the West, and it was a complete catastrophe for the Church. For nearly 40 years, From 1378 to 1417, Europe was divided in its loyalties. Some kingdoms supported the Pope in Rome, while others supported the Pope in Avignon. It was a religious and political nightmare, a situation where no one knew who the real head of the church was. It completely undermined the authority and legitimacy of the papacy, and it led to a lot of confusion and cynicism among the faithful. The solution to this problem was not simple. In 1409, a council of cardinals, exasperated by the situation, met and elected a third pope who was meant to replace the other two. This just made things worse, and now Europe had three popes. The situation was finally resolved at the Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418. The council, which was a huge gathering of bishops, cardinals, and secular rulers from all over Europe, was able to depose all three popes and elect a single new pope, Martin V, who was recognized by all of Christendom. The council also asserted its authority over the pope, arguing that a council had the right to make decisions for the good of the church, a theory known as conciliarism. This was a huge deal, a kind of medieval constitutional crisis that had a major impact on the relationship between the pope and the rest of the church hierarchy. The Great Schism and the events that surrounded it had a number of lasting consequences. It deeply damaged the reputation of the papacy and the church. People had seen the popes fighting for power, and it made them question the moral authority of the institution. It also gave rise to a number of new theological ideas and movements, like the one led by John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia. These men argued that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate source of religious authority, and they called for a reform of the church. They were a sort of proto-Protestant, and their ideas would lay the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation that would come later. The Great Schism was a moment of deep spiritual crisis for Europe. It was a time when the one institution that was meant to provide unity and stability was completely fractured. The church survived, of course, but it was a much weakened and more vulnerable institution. The events of this period showed that the Pope was not an all-powerful, infallible figure, but a political player who could be outmaneuvered and even deposed. It was a sort of dress rehearsal for the even bigger religious dramas that would come a century later, a time when the unity of the church would be broken forever. For now, though, the church was whole again, but it was a much more fragile kind of whole, a kind of unity that was born out of crisis and compromise. While the church was struggling through its great schism, and the kingdoms of Europe were busy with the 100 Years' War, the economic landscape of the continent was slowly but surely recovering from the devastation of the Black Death. The massive loss of life had ironically created a new kind of opportunity. With fewer people and the same amount of land, the value of labor had skyrocketed. This meant that the remaining peasants were no longer bound to the land in the same way. They could demand better wages, or they could simply move to a different manor where a lord was willing to give them a better deal. This newfound freedom helped to erode the old manorial system and ushered in a more fluid and more modern economic system. It was a kind of quiet revolution, a change that was driven by the grim arithmetic of a terrible plague. The recovery from the Black Death also led to a significant increase in agricultural output. With fewer mouths to feed, the land that was once used for growing food could be used for other purposes, like raising sheep for their wool. This led to a boom in the textile industry, particularly in Flanders and England. The towns, which had been hit hard by the plague, were now a magnet for people looking for work and opportunity. They became the centers of this new, revitalized economy, a place where people could make a living as artisans, merchants, or bankers. This was a very different kind of world from the one that had existed before the plague, one where wealth was no longer solely tied to the ownership of land. At the heart of this new economic system was the development of sophisticated banking and credit practices. Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, with their long-distance trade networks and their powerful merchant families, were at the forefront of this revolution. The Medici family of Florence, for example, started as simple wool merchants, but eventually became one of the most powerful banking families in Europe. They developed new financial tools, like the bill of exchange, which was a sort of medieval check that allowed merchants to pay for goods without having to carry large amounts of cash. This made long-distance trade much safer and more efficient. The Medici also developed the system of double-entry bookkeeping, a sort of financial innovation that is still in use today. These new banking practices allowed for a massive expansion of trade, not just in luxury goods, but in everyday items like grain, timber, and wine. The Hanseatic League, a powerful trading association of German towns, also dominated the trade routes of Northern Europe, controlling the flow of goods from the Baltic to the North Sea. They were a kind of medieval corporate entity, with their own laws, their own navy, and their own diplomatic corps. They were a testament to the power of cooperation and trade. The new wealth that was generated by this economic boom had a profound impact on the culture and society of Europe. It led to a new kind of patronage, where wealthy merchants and bankers, not just kings and popes, could fund art, literature, and science. It was a kind of democratization of culture, where the best artists and thinkers were no longer solely dependent on the church or the crown. Historians still argue about whether this new economic system was a direct result of the plague or if it was a natural evolution that was just sped up by the disaster. But there's no doubt that the late medieval period was a time of immense economic change. The old agricultural, land-based economy was slowly being replaced by a new, commercial, and urban-based one. This was a world that was becoming more complex, more interconnected, and more focused on the accumulation of wealth. It was a time of great opportunity for those who were able to adapt to the new reality, and a time of great challenge for those who were stuck in the old ways. The late medieval economy was, in a sense, a kind of dress rehearsal for the modern world, a time when the seeds of capitalism were being planted in the rich soil of a recovering continent. As Europe was finding its feet after the plague and the 100 Years' War, a very different kind of struggle was coming to a head on the Iberian Peninsula. This was the Reconquista, a centuries-long process by which the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal gradually pushed back against Muslim rule. This wasn't a single war or a single event, but a long, slow, and often interrupted process that stretched from the 8th to the 15th centuries. The story begins in 711 AD when a large Arab and Berber army, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and quickly conquered most of the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. The Muslim rulers, who called their territory Al-Andalus, established a highly sophisticated and culturally advanced civilization with its capital at Córdoba. For several centuries, Al-Andalus was a beacon of learning, a place where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in a society that was far more tolerant and intellectually vibrant than most of the rest of Europe. They made incredible advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and they built magnificent cities with grand mosques and libraries. But in the northern, mountainous parts of the peninsula, a number of small Christian kingdoms like Asturias, Navarre, and Aragon managed to survive. From these tiny holdouts, the idea of a reconquest or a reconquista began to take hold. It was a kind of holy war, a divine mission to reclaim the land for Christianity. The early stages of the reconquista were slow and piecemeal. The Christian kingdoms, which were often at war with each other, would only occasionally make gains against their more powerful Muslim neighbors. The turning point came in the 11th century when the Muslim states began to fracture into smaller warring kingdoms, a situation that the Christian rulers were able to exploit. With the support of knights from all over Europe, who saw the Reconquista as a kind of crusade, the Christian kingdoms began to expand southwards. The most famous hero of this era was El Cid, a Castilian knight who, though he was a mercenary who fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers, became a legendary figure in the Spanish imagination, a symbol of Christian resistance. The Reconquista was not just a military conflict, it was also a cultural one. As the Christian kingdoms expanded, they brought their own language, laws, and customs with them. The new territories were often repopulated with Christians from the north, and the great mosques were often converted into churches. The process of reconquest was slow but relentless. Major victories, like the capture of Toledo in 1085 and the decisive battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, pushed the Muslim rulers further and further south. By the mid-13th century, the only remaining Muslim kingdom was the Emirate of Granada, a beautiful and prosperous state in the far south of the peninsula, which managed to survive for another 2 centuries by paying tribute to the Christian kings and by being a formidable fortress. The Alhambra, the great palace fortress in Granada, is a lasting testament to the architectural and artistic genius of the last Muslim rulers in Spain. The end of the Reconquista finally came in 1492, a date that is famous for a very different reason. In that year, the Christian monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, who had married and united their 2 kingdoms, finally captured Granada. The last Muslim ruler in Spain was defeated, and the centuries-long process of reconquest was complete. The unity of Spain under a single powerful monarchy, which was a direct result of the Reconquista, was a huge deal. It created a powerful new nation-state that would soon become a major player on the world stage. But it also had a dark side. In that same year, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave Spain. It was a terrible moment of religious intolerance that expelled a vibrant community that had lived in Spain for centuries. The end of the Reconquista, therefore, was a moment of both triumph and tragedy, a moment that marked the birth of a new, powerful Spain, but also the end of a long, complex, and sometimes tolerant multicultural past. The Reconquista was a defining chapter in the history of Spain, a long, brutal, and glorious journey that was finally at an end. As the Reconquista was forging a new, unified Spain and the Hundred Years' War was winding down, the nature of political power in Europe was undergoing a fundamental change. The old feudal system, with its decentralized power structure of kings and semi-independent lords, was slowly but surely being replaced by a new model, the national monarchy. This was a system where a single ruler, a king or queen, held a much greater degree of centralized power, and their authority was based on the idea of a unified nation, not just a collection of feudal obligations. This shift was a long and messy process, and it was driven by a number of factors, including the long wars of the late medieval period, which required a new kind of professional army that was loyal to the king, not a local lord. The rise of a new urban, commercial class also played a role, as these merchants and bankers, who had no loyalty to the old feudal order, were willing to support a strong king who could provide stability and a favorable environment for trade. In England, the process of centralization was well underway. The Norman Conquest had already established a more powerful monarchy, and the Magna Carta, while it limited the king's power, also helped to create a new kind of political institution, the Parliament, which would eventually become a key part of the English government. The long struggle with France during the Hundred Years' War also helped to forge a new sense of English identity and a new kind of royal authority. The king was no longer just the head of a feudal pyramid. He was the leader of a nation, and his power was seen as a source of national pride and unity. This was solidified after a period of internal conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, a bloody civil war between two noble houses, which ended with the establishment of the powerful Tudor dynasty and a new kind of strong, centralized English monarchy. In France, the Hundred Years' War had a similar but even more dramatic effect. At the beginning of the war, the French king was a relatively weak figure, and the great dukes of Burgundy and Brittany were all but independent rulers. But the long, brutal war and the charismatic leadership of figures like Joan of Arc created a new sense of French national identity and a new loyalty to the king. The war also helped to create a new kind of professional army, one that was paid for by the king and was loyal to him alone, not a local lord. The final victory over the English cemented the French king's authority, and he was able to absorb the great feudal territories into his own kingdom. The French monarchy, under kings like Louis XV, became a powerful and absolute institution, one that was able to control the nobility and raise taxes and armies without having to rely on the old feudal system. In Spain, as we just saw, the Reconquista played a similar role. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms on the peninsula and created a new, powerful, and centralized Spanish monarchy. The long struggle against the Muslim rulers had created a strong sense of national and religious identity, and the crown was seen as the spiritual and political leader of a new, unified Spain. With the fall of Granada in 1492, the Spanish monarchs were able to turn their attention to a new kind of project: global exploration and conquest, a project that would require a strong, centralized, and well-funded state. The new monarchies of Europe were, in a sense, a product of the long, painful, and transformative processes of the late Middle Ages. The old world of feudalism, with its decentralized power and local loyalties, was slowly but surely being replaced by a new world of powerful kings, centralized states, and a new sense of national identity. This was the beginning of the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the modern one. The new rulers were a much more powerful kind of ruler, a kind of ruler that would define the political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. The old medieval kings were gone, and the new ones were just getting started. While the kingdoms of Western Europe were busy consolidating their power, the venerable Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, was slowly but surely fading. For centuries, Constantinople, its magnificent capital, had been a bastion of Christian civilization, a vibrant center of trade and learning that stood as a bulwark against invasions from the east. It had survived the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, and the Mongol invasions, a sort of historical cockroach that just refused to die. But by the late Middle Ages, the empire was a shadow of its former self. It was a fragmented and economically weakened state, surrounded by powerful and often hostile neighbors. Its long, slow decline was a sad and drawn-out affair, a sort of slow-motion farewell to a glorious past. The final act of this long drama began with the rise of a new power in the region, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were a powerful Muslim dynasty that had emerged in Anatolia, and they were a formidable military force. They were not just conquerors, they were also brilliant administrators and builders, and their empire was growing at an alarming rate. They had already conquered large parts of the Balkans and Anatolia, and they had Constantinople surrounded on all sides. The city, which had a population of hundreds of thousands in its heyday, was now a hollowed-out shell, a ghost of its former self. But its walls, the famous Theodosian walls, were still a formidable defense, and they were the one thing that had kept the city safe for over 1,000 years. The final siege of Constantinople began in 1453. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was a young and ambitious ruler, and he was determined to take the city. He had a massive army, and more importantly, a new and devastating technology on his side, the super cannon. This was a massive bronze cannon built by a Hungarian engineer that was so large it had to be pulled by a team of 60 oxen. It could fire huge stone balls that were able to smash through the walls that had held against every other invader. It was a kind of medieval Death Star, a weapon that completely changed the nature of siege warfare. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine V, had a tiny army of only a few thousand men to defend the city. He pleaded for help from the rest of Europe, but the Western kingdoms, embroiled in their own wars and squabbles, offered only a token force. It was a sad and lonely end for the last Roman emperor. The siege lasted for 53 days. The Ottomans launched a number of massive assaults, and the Byzantines fought with a fierce and desperate courage. But in the end, the cannon was too much. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans finally breached the walls and stormed into the city. The last Roman emperor, Constantine the XV reportedly died fighting in the streets, a final defiant act of a dying empire. The city was plundered, and the great church of the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople was a moment of profound significance. It was the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire, and with it, the last direct link to the Roman Empire was finally severed. It was a symbolic end to the medieval world, and a powerful symbol of the rise of a new and powerful Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople had a huge impact on the rest of Europe. Many Greek scholars and artists fled the city, taking with them their ancient manuscripts and knowledge of Greek language and philosophy. This diaspora of scholars and the knowledge they carried with them played a key role in igniting the Renaissance in Italy. The fall of the city also cut off the traditional land routes to the east, a major reason why the European powers began to look for new sea routes to India and China, which would eventually lead to the age of exploration. So the end of one great empire was, in a strange and terrible way, the beginning of a new chapter for the rest of Europe. The fall of Constantinople was a moment of deep shock and sadness for Christendom, but it was also a powerful catalyst for a new kind of world, one that was no longer dominated by the ghosts of a glorious past, but was instead looking to a new and uncertain future. With the fall of Constantinople, the stage was set for a new kind of cultural explosion, one that had been building for decades and was now supercharged by the influx of Greek scholars and their ancient texts. This was the Renaissance in Italy, a period of immense cultural, artistic, and intellectual revival that marked the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. The word Renaissance itself means rebirth, and that's exactly what it was. A rebirth of the classical ideals and knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. This wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual process that began in the Italian city-states, like Florence, Venice, and Rome, in the 14th century, and it was fueled by the new wealth of these cities, which had become the centers of trade and banking we talked about. This new class of wealthy merchants and bankers, like the Medici family of Florence, became the great patrons of the arts, funding a new generation of artists and thinkers. The key idea of the Renaissance was humanism, a new way of thinking that placed a greater emphasis on human potential and achievement. Humanists looked back to the works of ancient Roman and Greek thinkers, not just for their ideas on philosophy and law, but for a new kind of education that was focused on rhetoric, history, and poetry. They believed that a good education should not just prepare a person for the afterlife, but for a life of active and virtuous citizenship in this world. This was a significant departure from the medieval scholasticism, which was more focused on reconciling faith and reason. Humanists, while still devout Christians, were more interested in the beauty and complexity of the human experience itself. They wanted to understand what it meant to be a person, not just a soul waiting for heaven. This new way of thinking led to a revolution in art. Medieval art was often flat, stylized, and focused on religious themes. Renaissance art, on the other hand, was all about realism and human emotion. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man, and Michelangelo developed new techniques like perspective and chiaroscuro, the use of light and shadow, to create paintings and sculptures that were incredibly lifelike and three-dimensional. Michelangelo's sculpture of David, with its perfect anatomy and its sense of defiant power, is a perfect example of this new focus on the beauty and potential of the human form. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, with her mysterious smile, is a testament to the new interest in individual psychology and emotion. These artists were not just artisans, they were seen as geniuses, a new kind of social status that was a direct result of the humanist idea of human potential. The Renaissance also had a huge impact on science. Thinkers like Galileo Galilei and Copernicus began to question the old medieval view of the universe, which was based on the idea that the Earth was the center of everything. They used observation and mathematics to develop a new heliocentric model of the solar system, where the sun was at the center. This was a radical and deeply unsettling idea for many people, and it led to a major clash with the church, which was still holding on to the old geocentric view. But it was a sign that a new, more scientific way of looking at the world was beginning to take hold, one that was based on evidence and reason, not just on old authority. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth of old ideas, it was a birth of new ones. It was a time of immense creativity and innovation, a period when the foundations of the modern world were being laid. It gave us a new appreciation for art, a new kind of education, and a new way of looking at the universe. It was a period of profound cultural change, a long, beautiful, and sometimes chaotic journey that took Europe from the end of the Middle Ages to the dawn of the modern world. It was a time when everything seemed possible, and when the human spirit, for the first time in a long time, was given the freedom to fly. As the Renaissance was blossoming in Italy, a new kind of adventure was beginning to take shape in the minds of the monarchs and merchants of Portugal and Spain. The fall of Constantinople had, as we remember, cut off the traditional land routes to the east, making the silk and spice trade much more difficult and expensive. This created a powerful incentive to find a new route, a way to get to the rich markets of India and China by sea. It was a kind of geopolitical challenge that was perfect for the ambitious, newly centralized monarchies of the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese in particular, with their long coastline and their tradition of seafaring, were at the forefront of this new age of exploration. They were not looking for a new world, but a new way to get to the old one. The Portuguese, under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who was more of a desk jockey than a sailor, but was a brilliant organizer, began to explore the coast of Africa. They were not just looking for a new trade route, but also for a new source of gold, and in a more grim turn, slaves. They developed new technologies, like the caravel, a fast and highly maneuverable ship, and they used new navigational tools, like the astrolabe and the compass, which had come to Europe from the Arab world. Over the course of the 15th century, Portuguese sailors, with a kind of slow and methodical persistence, pushed further and further down the African coast. Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, a massive psychological breakthrough that proved it was possible to get to the Indian Ocean by sailing around Africa. And in 1498, Vasco da Gama finally made it all the way to India, establishing a new sea-based trade route that would bring immense wealth to Portugal. It was a long, dangerous, and very profitable journey. The Spanish, for their part, were a bit late to the party, but they had a different idea. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who was a bit of a maverick, had a crazy idea. Instead of sailing around Africa, why not just sail west, straight across the Atlantic, and reach Asia that way? His calculations were, to put it mildly, a bit off, but he was a brilliant salesman. He was able to convince Ferdinand and Isabella, the new, powerful monarchs of a unified Spain, to fund his expedition. In 1492, the same year they captured Granada and expelled the Jews, Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, and in an event that would forever change the world, he landed in the Americas. He thought he had reached the East Indies, and he famously called the native people he found there Indians. He was completely wrong, of course, but the discovery of a new continent, a new world as it came to be known, was a far bigger prize than any trade route to India. The initial result of these voyages was a complete disaster for the native peoples of the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors, with their superior weapons and their devastating diseases, were able to conquer the great empires of the Aztecs and the Incas, a process that was brutal, bloody, and almost unbelievably fast. They also brought diseases like smallpox, which the native populations had no immunity to, and which killed millions. It was a sort of medieval biological warfare, but a completely unintentional one. But for the European powers, the discovery of the Americas was a source of immense wealth and power. The gold and silver of the New World began to flow back to Spain, making it the richest and most powerful nation in Europe. The age of exploration was a truly transformative moment. It was a time when the world, which had been seen as a series of connected landmasses, was suddenly seen as a much bigger place, a globe with a vast, unknown ocean that could be crossed. It was a time when European powers, with their new technologies and their ambitious monarchs, began to look beyond their own borders and to think in terms of a global empire. It was a direct result of the changes that had been happening in the late Middle Ages, the rise of centralized monarchies, the development of new technologies, and the new economic reality of a post-plague world. The age of exploration was a sort of grand finale for the medieval period, and a powerful overture for the modern world, a world that would be defined by global trade, conquest, and the new powerful nations that had made it all possible. The age of exploration was a physical journey that reshaped the world, but at the same time, an equally profound journey was taking place in the world of ideas. This journey was made possible by one of the most important inventions in all of human history, the printing press. For most of the Middle Ages, books were a luxury item, a rare and expensive commodity. They had to be painstakingly copied by hand by scribes, a process that was incredibly slow and prone to errors. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the main centers of this work, and a single book could take months or even years to complete. As a result, books were only available to a tiny elite of clergy, scholars, and wealthy nobles. Knowledge, therefore, was a controlled and very limited resource. All of that changed in the mid-15th century. A German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg developed a new and revolutionary technology, a printing press with movable type. This wasn't a single invention, but a combination of different technologies. including a press that was adapted from a wine press, a new kind of oil-based ink that could stick to metal, and, most importantly, a process for casting individual, reusable metal letters. The most famous early book printed on his press was the Gutenberg Bible, a beautiful and monumental work that was published around 1455. It was a masterpiece of printing, and it was a proof of concept that showed just how powerful and transformative this new technology could be. The impact of the printing press was immediate and immense. Books, which had been a luxury, were now becoming a mass-produced item. The cost of a book dropped dramatically, and their availability skyrocketed. Knowledge was no longer a limited resource. It was becoming a commodity that could be bought and sold. This had a profound impact on literacy rates, which began to rise as more people had access to books. It also helped to standardize languages. Before the printing press, there were dozens of different dialects in every country, but as people began to read books that were all printed in the same way, the written language began to standardize. It was a kind of a medieval spell check, but on a massive scale. The printing press also played a key role in the spread of new ideas. The new humanism of the Renaissance, with its focus on classical learning and its new ideas about the world, was able to spread from Italy to the rest of Europe with a speed and a scale that would have been impossible before. The scientific discoveries of the Renaissance, like the heliocentric model of the universe, could be published and debated by scholars all over Europe. The printing press was a sort of intellectual accelerant, a technology that sped up the entire process of cultural and scientific change. It was a powerful new tool for thinkers and reformers, a way to get their message out to a much wider audience. The printing press also, and perhaps most importantly, played a central role in the Protestant Reformation. When a German monk named Martin Luther wrote his famous 95 Theses in 1517, he didn't just nail them to a church door. He also had them printed and distributed all over Germany. His ideas, which were a direct challenge to the authority of the Pope and the Church, spread like wildfire. The printing press was a kind of a historical megaphone, and it was a key reason why the Reformation, unlike earlier reform movements, was able to succeed. The Church, which had been in control of the flow of information for centuries, was now facing a new kind of challenge, one that it was completely unprepared for. Historians still argue whether the printing press was the most important invention of the last 1,000 years, but there's no doubt that it was a truly revolutionary technology. It broke the church's monopoly on knowledge. It helped to create a new, more literate and more questioning population, and it was a powerful catalyst for the great intellectual and religious movements that would define the early modern period. It was a single invention that completely changed the way people thought about the world and their place in it, and its impact is still with us today. The printing press and the new flow of ideas that it created had a direct and often painful impact on one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church. As we remember from the Great Schism, the Church's authority had already been shaken, and now it was facing a new kind of challenge: heresy. Heresy was any belief or teaching that went against the official doctrines of the Church, and for the Church, it was a very serious offense. It was a threat to the spiritual well-being of the faithful, and a challenge to the institution's very authority. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church had a number of ways of dealing with heresy, from trying to persuade the heretics to come back to the fold to, in a more grim turn, burning them at the stake. One of the most famous medieval heresies was the Cathar movement, which flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries in southern France. The Cathars believed in a dualistic universe, with a good god of light and a bad god of darkness. They rejected the authority of the Church and the sacraments, and they lived a very simple, austere life, which made them very popular with the common people who were tired of the wealth and corruption of the official church. The Church, however, saw the Cathars as a mortal threat, and it launched a full-scale military campaign against them, the Albigensian Crusade, which was a brutal and bloody war that almost completely wiped out the Cathar movement. It was a clear message from the Church. Do not mess with our authority. Another famous heretic was John Wycliffe, an English priest and scholar in the 14th century. He was a kind of spiritual rebel who argued that the Church had become too wealthy and too worldly. He believed that the Bible was the ultimate source of religious authority and that it should be translated into the language of the people so that everyone, not just the clergy, could read it. His followers, the Lollards, were a popular movement that spread his ideas throughout England. The Church, of course, condemned him as a heretic, but he was protected by the English nobility and died of natural causes. His ideas, however, lived on and had a huge influence on later reformers. A student of his, Jan Hus in Bohemia, went even further. He preached in the local language, criticized the sale of indulgences, and argued that a council, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority in the Church. He was invited to the Council of Constance, the one that ended the Great Schism, with a promise of safe conduct, but he was arrested, put on trial, and burned at the stake as a heretic in 1415. He was a martyr for the cause of reform, and his death sparked a long and bloody religious war in Bohemia. In response to the growing threat of heresy, the Church developed a new institution, the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a formal tribunal that was set up by the Pope to investigate and prosecute people who were suspected of heresy. It was a system that was based on the idea that the Church had a duty to protect the faithful from false teachings, and it was a very effective, if also very brutal, tool. The Inquisition used a number of methods to get confessions, including torture, and it often relied on anonymous accusations. A person who was found guilty of heresy could be punished with everything from a fine and a penance to a prison sentence, and in the most extreme cases, being handed over to the secular authorities to be burned at the stake. The Inquisition was a powerful and terrifying institution, a kind of medieval secret police that was dedicated to enforcing religious orthodoxy. Historians still argue whether the Inquisition was a necessary evil, a way of preserving the unity of the Church in a time of great change, or if it was a terrible, abusive institution that was a stain on the memory of the Church. The truth is probably a bit of both. It was a product of a world where religious belief was seen as the bedrock of society, and a challenge to that belief was seen as a challenge to the entire social order. The Inquisition was, in a sense, a symptom of a larger problem. The church was becoming more and more powerful, and it was also becoming more and more resistant to change. This tension between the desire for reform and the need for orthodoxy was a major theme of the late Middle Ages, and it was a tension that would eventually explode in the Reformation. The Inquisition was the church's attempt to put a lid on the boiling pot of new ideas and beliefs, but in the end, the lid was not strong enough. As we reach the final moments of our journey, we can see that the medieval world wasn't a static, unchanging period, but a time of immense transformation, a long and messy transition from the world of ancient empires to the world of modern nations. The ideas, institutions, and events we've talked about, from feudalism to the Crusades, from the Black Death to the printing press, were all part of a gradual but profound shift in the way people lived, worked, and thought. The old order, with its powerful papacy, its decentralized feudal system, and its deeply religious worldview, was slowly but surely giving way to a new one. The final end of the medieval world didn't happen in a single year or with a single event. It was a long, slow process, a kind of historical sunset. But if we had to pick a few key themes that signal the end of this period, we can look at the decline of the old institutions and the rise of the new. The great feudal lords, with their castles and their knights, were becoming less and less important as powerful national monarchies rose to power, with their professional armies and their centralized states. The king was no longer just the head of a feudal pyramid. He was the leader of a nation, and his power was based on taxes and loyalty, not just on land and military service. The old local loyalties were being replaced by a new, more powerful sense of national identity. This was a huge deal, a kind of political divorce from the past. The church, which had been the central and unifying force of the Middle Ages, was also losing its grip. The Great Schism and the rise of heresy had deeply damaged its authority. The new printing press was making it impossible for the church to control the flow of information, and the new humanism of the Renaissance was creating a more questioning and independent-minded population. The great reformers, like Martin Luther, were able to use this new technology to spread their ideas, and in 1517, the Protestant Reformation officially began, a moment that shattered the religious unity of Europe forever. The Pope, who had once been able to command kings, was now just the leader of one part of Christendom, not all of it. The economic and social foundations of the medieval world were also changing. The old manorial system, which was based on the labor of serfs, was a thing of the past. The new urban economy, with its merchants, its guilds, and its powerful banking families, was becoming the engine of the new world. Wealth was no longer just about land, it was about commerce and trade, and this led to a new kind of social mobility and a new kind of power. The age of exploration was a direct result of this new economic reality, as the powerful monarchies and merchants of Europe looked for new trade routes and new sources of wealth. The world, which had been centered on Europe, was now becoming a much bigger, more global place. So the end of the Middle Ages wasn't a single event, but a whole lot of them, all happening at once. The rise of new nations, the decline of the old church, the invention of the printing press, the rediscovery of ancient learning, and the discovery of a new world. All of these things, in their own way, helped to close the book on the medieval period and to open a new one on the modern world. The slow, methodical pace of the Middle Ages, with its clear social and religious order, was being replaced by a new, more dynamic, and more chaotic world. The end of our story, therefore, is not a grand finale, but a quiet farewell to a long and complex age. And so, the story of medieval Europe, with all its knights, its castles, its popes, and its plagues, slowly comes to a close. The great characters of this long sleep, Charlemagne, William the Conqueror, Joan of Arc, and the rest, have now played their parts and have faded into the mists of time. Their stories sank into legend, and their world became a forgotten thing, a whisper in the halls of history. The great cathedrals stand as silent witnesses. The castles crumble into dust, and the old trade routes have been forgotten, but their story lives on in the quiet, gentle hum of a world that was born from their ashes. The names of the kings and queens, the heroes and the villains, the thinkers and the artists, all fade now, like the last embers of a campfire at dawn. The great conflicts are over, the triumphs and the tragedies have passed into memory, and all that remains is the soft echo of a world that once was, a world that we have just journeyed through together. Sleep now, and let the quiet currents of history carry you away. The story is over, and the dawn is not yet here. Rest your mind, and let the long sleep of the ages, with all its secrets and its wonders, carry you to a peaceful and quiet place. The journey is at an end, and it is time for you to let go. Sleep now, and dream of a time that was.